Hey guys, tonight we're drifting far away from the rush of the modern world and into the quiet forests of ancient Central America, where towering stone cities once stood beneath endless green canopies. Before we begin, find a comfortable position, soften your breathing, and allow your thoughts to slow. This journey isn't about excitement or suspense. It's about gently wandering through one of history's greatest mysteries until sleep quietly finds you. Nearly 1,500 years ago, the Maya world was filled with life. Long before sunrise, farmers stepped into fields of maize while a cool mist still covered the valleys. Women prepared simple meals over small cooking fires, and children chased each other across open courtyards. Birds called from the rainforest as priests slowly climbed steep temple staircases to greet another day beneath the rising sun. If you had arrived at one of these cities during its greatest years, nothing would have suggested that history would one day call this civilization a mystery. The plazas were crowded with merchants selling colorful feathers, polished jade, cacao beans, pottery, woven cloth, and carved ornaments. Skilled stone workers carefully shaped enormous limestone blocks, while artists painted walls with bright reds, blues, and yellows that have long since faded away. Unlike Rome or ancient Egypt, the Maya were never ruled by a single emperor. Instead, dozens of powerful city-states spread across what is now southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. Every city had its own king, its own temples, its own traditions, and sometimes its own rivals. Yet together they created one of the most remarkable civilizations the ancient world had ever seen. The Maya observed the stars with astonishing precision. They calculated calendars so accurate that modern scientists still admire their knowledge. Their mathematicians understood the concept of 0 centuries before many parts of Europe. Massive pyramids rose high above the jungle without iron tools, wheeled carts, or large working animals. Every stone was moved by patient human hands. As the morning sun climbed higher, golden light spilled across carved monuments covered with mysterious symbols. Those carvings recorded the victories of kings, the passing of time, and ceremonies believed to keep the universe in perfect balance. Everything appeared peaceful, ordered, and enduring. But history often hides its greatest changes behind ordinary days. No one waking up that morning could have imagined that, over the centuries ahead, many of these magnificent cities would slowly fall silent. And that quiet mystery is where our journey truly begins. The day continued gently beneath the warm tropical sun, and the city seemed to breathe with quiet confidence. Stone roads carried merchants from one neighborhood to another, while noble families moved through palace courtyards decorated with painted murals and carefully carved statues. The scent of fresh maize tortillas mixed with the earthy smell of wet limestone after an early morning rain. Everywhere you looked, there was evidence of careful planning and remarkable skill. Above the city, colorful macaws flew between towering trees, their bright feathers flashing against the deep green forest. Monkeys called from distant branches, and somewhere beyond the temples, a slow-moving river reflected the afternoon sky. To an ordinary visitor, this place would have appeared almost timeless, as though it had always existed and always would. Life in a Maya city followed rhythms that rarely changed. Farmers tended fields of maize, beans, and squash, crops that formed the foundation of daily life. These plants were more than food. According to Maya belief, humanity itself had been created from maize. Every successful harvest reminded people that the gods continued to bless the land, while every failed crop raised quiet concerns that perhaps something in the balance of the world had shifted. The rulers understood that their authority depended not only on military strength but also on spiritual leadership. Kings performed sacred ceremonies, offered valuable gifts to the gods, and sometimes even shed their own blood during important rituals. These acts were believed to maintain harmony between heaven, earth, and the mysterious underworld that existed beneath both. At night, families gathered outside their homes as the heat slowly faded. They shared simple meals, listened to stories told by grandparents, and watched countless stars appear above the jungle. Without modern lights, the night sky seemed impossibly bright. The Milky Way stretched across the darkness like a glowing river, and Maya astronomers carefully recorded the movement of planets with astonishing accuracy. Astonishing accuracy. Everything around them suggested stability. Strong rulers governed magnificent cities. Trade routes remained active. Crops continued to grow. Temples reached toward the sky with quiet confidence. Yet history teaches us that great civilizations rarely disappear overnight. The first signs of change are often so small that almost no one notices them. A harvest that produces slightly less food than expected. A season with less rain than usual. A neighboring city becoming just a little more hostile than before. Each event seems manageable by itself. But over many generations, small problems can quietly grow into something much larger. The people living here could not see the future. They simply woke each morning, worked their fields, honored their traditions, and trusted that tomorrow would look much like yesterday. For now, the forest remained peaceful. The temples still stood proudly above the trees. And the greatest mystery in Maya history had not yet begun. As another peaceful season unfolded, the people of the Maya world continued their daily routines without knowing they were living through the height of their civilization. At sunrise, the city's plazas slowly filled with quiet activity. Farmers carried woven baskets toward the fields, craftsmen opened small workshops, and merchants prepared goods that had traveled hundreds of miles through forests, rivers, and mountain paths. Trade connected nearly every major Maya city. Jade arrived from distant valleys, obsidian came from volcanic regions, colorful feathers were brought from tropical forests, and fine pottery passed from one kingdom to another. These valuable goods were more than simple products. They represented friendships, alliances, and sometimes uneasy peace between neighboring rulers. The king's palace overlooked the central plaza, reminding everyone who held power. Yet being a Maya ruler was never easy. A king was expected to be a military leader, a wise judge, and a bridge between humans and the gods. If the rains arrived on time and harvests were plentiful, people praised their ruler. But if drought struck or enemies attacked, many believed the king had somehow failed in his sacred duties. Beyond the city's stone buildings, thousands of ordinary families lived in smaller homes built from wood, mud, and thatched roofs. Their lives were quieter than those of nobles, but no less important. They planted maize, gathered firewood, cared for children, and passed stories from one generation to the next. These families formed the true foundation of Maya society. At sunset, smoke drifted gently above the rooftops as evening meals were prepared. The sounds of birds slowly faded, replaced by insects singing beneath the darkening sky. Looking around, almost everything suggested that this remarkable civilization would continue for centuries without interruption. But history often changes so gradually that no single person notices the beginning. One unusually dry year could be dismissed as bad luck. A disagreement between neighboring rulers might seem temporary. A slightly smaller harvest could always be blamed on changing weather. No one realized that these small events, scattered across different cities and different generations, might someday connect like tiny stones forming the first cracks beneath a great monument. For now, life remained calm. The forests were still green, the temples still echoed with prayers, and the future still seemed as strong as the ancient limestone beneath their feet. Part 4. For generations, the Maya believed that time moved in great cycles. Every sunrise, every harvest, every ceremony fit into a pattern that had repeated for centuries. Their calendars were not simply tools for counting days. They were sacred guides that helped determine when crops should be planted, when temples should hold ceremonies, and when kings should perform rituals believed to keep the universe in balance. The priests spent countless nights studying the heavens. They watched Venus appear before dawn, followed the changing face of the moon, and carefully recorded eclipses that seemed to carry messages from the gods. Their observations were so precise that even today historians continue to admire the mathematical skill behind them. Meanwhile, life below continued at a gentle pace. Stone masons shaped fresh limestone blocks beneath the warm afternoon sun. Sculptors carved the faces of rulers into tall monuments that would stand for generations. Scribes patiently painted folded bark paper books filled with history, astronomy, and sacred knowledge. Every task was completed with remarkable patience, as though everyone believed there would always be another tomorrow. The forests surrounding the cities provided almost everything people needed. Tall trees supplied timber for homes and temples. Rivers carried fish through quiet waters. Hunters returned with deer, wild turkey, and other animals that had lived beside the Maya for countless generations. The jungle was not an enemy. It was a trusted neighbor that had supported their civilization for centuries. Yet even healthy forests have limits. Every new temple required thousands of limestone blocks. Burning limestone into plaster demanded enormous amounts of firewood. As cities expanded, more trees disappeared. More fields replaced untouched woodland. More families needed food each passing generation. None of these changes seemed dangerous on their own. A few more trees cut this year. A slightly larger field next season. Another village built beyond the old farmland. Each decision appeared reasonable, even necessary. No one could see the larger picture forming across the landscape. The changes were too slow for a single lifetime. Children simply accepted the world they inherited, never realizing it looked slightly different from the one their grandparents had known. As evening settled over the city once again, golden light touched the tops of the Great Pyramids before fading into darkness. Cooking fires flickered quietly across the neighborhoods. Families gathered for simple meals, and the stars slowly returned above the silent jungle. Everything still felt peaceful. Everything still felt permanent. And yet, somewhere beyond the distant horizon, the first quiet whispers of change had already begun. Part 5. The passing years brought quiet prosperity to many Maya cities. New temples reached higher into the sky, their steep stairways glowing white beneath the tropical sun. Every successful harvest encouraged rulers to build even grander monuments, believing that magnificent cities reflected the favor of the gods. The sound of stone hammers echoed from sunrise until evening as skilled workers patiently shaped blocks that would stand for centuries. The population continued to grow. Families welcomed new children, villages expanded into towns, and towns slowly became impressive cities connected by busy trade routes. Travelers carried cacao beans, salt, obsidian blades, woven cotton cloth, seashells, and polished jade across hundreds of miles. News traveled with them, spreading stories of powerful kings, successful harvests, and magnificent ceremonies held beneath towering pyramids. At the heart of every city stood enormous reservoirs designed to collect precious rainwater. Unlike many civilizations, the Maya had very few large rivers flowing directly through their greatest cities. Instead, they depended heavily on seasonal rains. During the wet months, reservoirs filled with fresh water. During the long dry season, those carefully stored supplies kept entire communities alive. For many generations, this remarkable system worked beautifully. The rains arrived, the reservoirs filled, the crops grew, life continued. Because everything had worked for so long, few people questioned whether nature might someday behave differently. Most believed the familiar rhythm of the seasons would continue forever, just as it always had. Yet nature rarely promises permanence. Some years brought slightly shorter rainy seasons. The difference seemed almost impossible to notice at first. Farmers simply worked harder. Reservoirs remained full enough to meet everyone's needs. Kings assured their people that the gods still smiled upon their cities. No one panicked. There was no sudden disaster, only tiny changes that seemed too small to matter. But history often begins with details so quiet that they pass unnoticed. A little less rain, a few more mouths to feed, a little more forest cleared for farmland. Each challenge appeared manageable by itself. Together, however, they were slowly reshaping the future of one of the world's greatest civilizations. As darkness settled across the jungle once more, thousands of families looked toward tomorrow with complete confidence. They had no reason to believe that the peaceful world surrounding them could ever become something different. The silence of the forest kept its secrets, and the greatest mystery in Maya history continued to unfold, one ordinary day at a time. Another generation came and went, and the great Maya cities continued to shine beneath the tropical sun. Children grew into adults, farmers passed their fields to their sons and daughters, and rulers celebrated the anniversaries of their reigns with elaborate ceremonies. To the people living through these years, the future still looked secure. Their ancestors had built these magnificent cities, and they believed their descendants would inherit them forever. Each morning began with familiar routines. Smoke drifted upward from household fires as families prepared simple meals of maize porridge and fresh tortillas. Potters shaped clay into jars for storing water and grain. Weavers worked patiently with colorful cotton thread, creating cloth that would be traded across distant kingdoms. The steady rhythm of daily life rarely changed, offering comfort in its predictability. Yet beneath this peaceful surface, competition between neighboring cities quietly intensified. Every ruler wanted to leave behind a greater legacy than the king before him. Taller temples were built. Larger palaces rose above the plazas. More monuments were carved to celebrate victories and royal achievements. These projects required thousands of workers, enormous quantities of limestone, and vast amounts of timber gathered from the surrounding forests. As the cities expanded, nearby farmland became increasingly valuable. Families cleared more trees to create fresh fields for maize, beans, and squash. Hillsides that had once been covered by thick forests slowly opened to the sun. At first, the harvests remained generous, and few questioned whether the land itself might eventually grow tired. The Maya possessed remarkable agricultural knowledge. They built terraces, managed wetlands, and carefully adapted to difficult landscapes. Their farmers understood the seasons better than almost anyone else in the ancient world. But even the greatest farming skills depended upon something no human could control. Then, without dependable seasonal rains, every carefully planned system became more fragile. For now, however, the skies remained kind. Reservoirs still held enough water. Markets remained busy. Festivals filled the plazas with music, dancing, and colorful clothing. Travelers arriving from distant cities saw only wealth, confidence, and extraordinary achievements. No visitor could have guessed that invisible pressures were slowly building beneath the surface. Like tiny roots pushing against solid stone, these changes were almost impossible to notice from one year to the next. History seldom announces itself with a single dramatic moment. Instead, it whispers, quietly, patiently, and by the time those whispers become impossible to ignore, the course of an entire civilization may already have begun to change. As the years slipped quietly by, the Maya world reached what many historians now call its greatest height. Magnificent cities stretched across the landscape, each one proudly displaying its own temples, palaces, and towering monuments. Kings competed not only through warfare but through architecture, hoping future generations would remember their names carved into stone. The city plazas remained lively from dawn until dusk. Merchants greeted familiar customers, children carried baskets for their parents, and travelers rested before continuing their journeys along forest paths. Exotic goods still flowed between distant kingdoms. Bright quetzal feathers, polished jade, obsidian blades, seashells from the coast, and rich cacao beans all changed hands, connecting communities separated by hundreds of miles. Yet beneath this appearance of prosperity, rulers faced growing responsibilities. Larger populations required more food, more water, and more farmland. Every successful harvest encouraged further growth, creating an endless cycle of expansion. New homes appeared beyond the city's original boundaries, and forests that had stood for centuries slowly disappeared beneath carefully planted fields. The land continued to provide, but not quite as generously as before. Farmers began noticing that some fields produced smaller harvests after years of continuous planting. They adapted by clearing fresh land deeper into the surrounding forest. It solved the immediate problem, but each solution demanded even more trees, more labor, and more time. Meanwhile, the rulers continued building. Another temple, another palace, another carved monument celebrating another victory. These impressive projects inspired pride, yet they also consumed enormous resources. Limestone had to be quarried, transported, and shaped. Plaster required vast amounts of firewood to produce. Thousands of workers devoted months, sometimes years, to construction instead of farming. Still, life felt remarkably normal. The evening air remained filled with the sounds of insects. The stars still appeared with perfect regularity. Sacred ceremonies continued exactly as they always had. If someone had stood atop the highest pyramid and looked across the endless jungle, they would have seen a civilization that appeared strong, organized, and permanent. But history often teaches a quiet lesson. And the greatest challenges sometimes begin long before anyone realizes they exist. The Maya could not see the centuries ahead. They simply lived one peaceful day after another, believing the balance between their cities, their forests, and the heavens would always endure. Soon, however, that ancient balance would face its first true test. A single dry season could be survived. A difficult harvest could be overcome. But repeated challenges would test even the strongest civilization. The Maya had built incredible cities from stone and human determination. They had created calendars, mathematics, and architecture that still amaze the modern world. Yet they depended on something far more fragile than stone. They depended on the sky, and the sky was beginning to change. The first signs of trouble did not arrive like a great storm. There was no single moment when the Maya people looked around and realized their world was changing. Instead, the transformation happened slowly, hidden inside ordinary seasons and everyday decisions. A farmer waking before sunrise would not have noticed that history was moving in a different direction. He would have stepped outside, looked toward the sky, and wondered if the coming rains would be generous. He would have walked through his fields, checked the growing maize plants, and hoped that the soil would continue to provide for his family. Across the Maya world, thousands of farmers shared the same hope. The cities depended on them. The temples, palaces, and markets could only exist because ordinary people worked the land. Behind every grand monument stood countless farmers who planted seeds, carried water, and protected crops from the challenges of nature. But as populations grew larger, the pressure on agriculture became stronger. A field that once supported one family had to support many more. Forests that had provided natural protection for the soil were replaced by farmland. In some areas, erosion slowly removed valuable nutrients from the ground. The land was still productive, but it required more effort than before. The Maya responded with determination. They created new farming methods. They improved water storage. They adapted their techniques. For a time, their knowledge helped them overcome these difficulties. But the challenges were becoming more complicated. The great cities of the Maya lowlands depended heavily on seasonal rainfall. Unlike regions with large permanent rivers, many Maya centers relied on reservoirs, underground water sources, and carefully managed systems to survive the dry months. When the rains came, life flourished. When the rains failed, every part of society felt the impact. The rulers felt pressure because their people expected protection and prosperity. The farmers felt pressure because their families depended on successful harvests. The cities felt pressure because thousands of people required food and water every day. A civilization that had mastered astronomy, mathematics, and architecture now faced a challenge that no amount of knowledge could completely control. The changing climate did not destroy the Maya overnight. Instead, it slowly tested their ability to adapt. And adaptation became more difficult as other problems began appearing at the same time. Political conflicts increased between rival cities. Powerful kings competed for influence. Resources became more valuable. Trust between neighboring kingdoms became weaker. The Maya world was still magnificent. The temples still stood. The ceremonies still continued. The markets were still active. But beneath the beauty of the civilization, small cracks were beginning to appear. Like a quiet shadow moving across the forest floor, change was approaching slowly, and most people had no idea how much their world was about to transform. The Maya cities continued to stand proudly beneath the endless tropical sky, but the world around them was becoming more difficult to manage. For centuries, their civilization had depended on a delicate balance between people, nature, and tradition. When that balance worked, cities flourished. When it began to weaken, Even the greatest achievements of the Maya faced uncertainty. In the royal courts, kings continued to present an image of strength. They wore elaborate clothing decorated with feathers and precious stones. They carried symbols of authority and appeared before crowds during important ceremonies. Their monuments recorded victories, alliances, and their connection to the spiritual world. But behind these public displays of confidence, rulers faced growing challenges. A king's power depended on his ability to provide stability. The people expected successful harvests, protection from enemies, and continued prosperity. If crops failed or conflicts increased, questions about leadership could slowly begin to appear. In many Maya cities, competition between rulers became more intense. Neighboring kingdoms fought for control of valuable resources and important trade routes. These conflicts were not always massive wars, but they created tension throughout the region. A captured enemy ruler could bring great honor. A military victory could strengthen a king's reputation. A successful alliance could increase a city's influence. But constant competition also consumed resources that could have been used elsewhere. Soldiers needed supplies. Warriors needed support. Monuments celebrating victories required labor. As more energy was focused on political struggles, ordinary people continued facing the challenges of daily survival. The farmers who lived far from the royal centers had different concerns. They were not thinking about royal rivalries or political achievements. They were watching the clouds, waiting for rain, and protecting whatever crops they could grow. For them, history was measured differently. A good harvest meant security. Poor harvest meant uncertainty. A full reservoir meant hope. An empty reservoir meant fear. The Maya had survived difficult periods before. Their ancestors had experienced changing environments, conflicts, and hardships. They had always found ways to adapt. But this time, several problems were arriving together. The climate was becoming less predictable. The population had reached enormous levels. Natural resources were under increasing pressure. And political competition was making cooperation more difficult. Still, the Maya world was far from finished. Many cities remained powerful. Many communities continued to thrive. Millions of people still lived their lives according to ancient traditions that had guided them for generations. The collapse was not a sudden disappearance. It was a slow transformation that unfolded over many years. To understand what happened, we must move beyond the idea of one great disaster and look closely at the many small changes that gradually reshaped the Maya world. Because sometimes civilizations do not fall in a single moment. Sometimes they slowly lose the balance that once made them strong. The great Maya cities entered a period of increasing uncertainty, yet from the outside, they still appeared powerful and impressive. Travelers arriving from distant regions would have seen enormous temples rising above the jungle, crowded marketplaces filled with valuable goods, and communities continuing traditions that had existed for hundreds of years. The Maya world was not collapsing in an obvious way. There were no empty streets, no abandoned temples, no sudden disappearance of the people. Instead, the changes were happening slowly, almost silently. In some cities, rulers began building fewer monuments than before. The once frequent inscriptions celebrating royal achievements became less common. Archaeologists studying these ancient records noticed that something had changed. The voices of kings, once carved proudly into stone, began to grow quieter. This did not happen everywhere at the same time. The Maya civilization was not one single kingdom. It was a collection of many different cities, each with its own ruler, economy, and challenges. Some places struggled while others continued to grow. Some cities adapted successfully while others slowly lost their importance. This is one reason the Maya collapse remains such a fascinating mystery. There was no single ending. There was a long period of transformation. Deep within the forests, ordinary people continued their daily lives. Farmers still planted seeds when the seasons allowed. Families still gathered around evening fires. Children still learned stories from their elders. Life continued even as the larger political world around them became less stable. But maintaining a large civilization required cooperation. Cities needed trade. Farmers needed reliable water. Rulers needed the support of their people. Neighboring kingdoms needed agreements. When these connections weakened, the entire system became more fragile. Imagine a carefully balanced stone structure. Each stone supports another. Remove one small piece, and the structure may remain standing. Remove many pieces over time, and the balance begins to change. The Maya world was facing a similar challenge. Climate pressures were making resources more valuable. Growing populations were increasing demand. Political conflicts were reducing cooperation. Each problem alone might have been manageable. Together, they created a much greater challenge. The people living during this period could not see the full picture. They did not know that centuries later, historians would study their abandoned cities and search for answers. They were simply trying to survive, protect their families, and preserve the traditions passed down from their ancestors. As another night settled over the rainforest, the temples remained silent beneath the stars. The same sky that Maya astronomers had studied for generations continued its endless journey above them. The civilization was still alive. The cities were still breathing, but the age of certainty was slowly fading away. The Maya world continued its long journey through a changing age. The great cities still carried the memories of countless generations, but the confidence that once filled their plazas was beginning to weaken. The people who lived during this time did not wake up one morning knowing they were entering a difficult period. They simply noticed that some things were becoming harder than before. A farmer might have noticed that the rains arrived later than expected. A merchant might have traveled farther to find valuable goods. A ruler might have struggled to maintain alliances with neighboring cities. Each person experienced only a small part of a much larger story. In the crowded markets, life continued with familiar sounds. Traders called out their prices, families exchanged goods, and craftsmen displayed their finest creations. The Maya economy was still active, and many communities remained prosperous. But behind the activity, competition for resources was increasing. Water became more important than ever. During the rainy season, people worked to collect and store as much water as possible. Large reservoirs became essential parts of city life. Engineers carefully designed systems to capture rainfall and protect communities during dry periods. For generations, these methods had supported enormous populations. But as the climate became less predictable, even advanced systems faced greater challenges. A reservoir that was once full for many months could empty sooner. A harvest that once provided enough food could become uncertain. A dry season that once felt normal could become dangerous when repeated year after year. The Maya understood their environment better than almost any civilization of their time. They watched the skies, studied natural patterns, and adjusted their farming methods. Their knowledge was impressive, but knowledge could only go so far. Nature created challenges that no ruler, priest, or farmer could completely control. Meanwhile, the relationship between Maya cities became increasingly complicated. Some rulers attempted to strengthen their power through military campaigns. Others created alliances through marriage and trade. The political landscape shifted constantly, with cities rising and falling in influence. For ordinary families, these struggles created uncertainty. A peaceful border could become a dangerous one. A reliable trade route could become interrupted. A powerful city could suddenly become weaker. Yet despite these difficulties, the Maya people continued to show remarkable resilience. They adapted, moved, rebuilt, and found new ways to survive. Their civilization was not disappearing. It was changing. This is why the story of the Maya collapse is not simply a story about failure. It is a story about endurance. It is a story about people facing enormous challenges while trying to preserve the world they had created. As the evening mist covered the forests and the last sunlight disappeared behind ancient temples, the Maya cities remained surrounded by mystery. The stones remembered, the forests remembered, and slowly, history began recording the quiet transformation of one of the world's most fascinating civilizations. The years continued to pass over the Maya lands, carrying with them both moments of greatness and growing uncertainty. The magnificent cities that had once seemed unstoppable were now entering a period where every decision mattered more than before. The Maya people still built, traded, farmed, and celebrated, but the world around them was becoming less forgiving. In the forests surrounding the cities, the changing landscape told a quiet story. Areas that had once been covered with thick trees were now filled with fields and settlements. The Maya had transformed the environment to support their growing population, creating one of the most productive landscapes of the ancient Americas. But every transformation had consequences. The forests had protected the soil from heavy tropical rains. Their roots helped hold the earth together. Their leaves returned nutrients to the ground. As more forests disappeared, some areas became more vulnerable to erosion. When heavy rains arrived, valuable soil could be carried away. When dry seasons came, exhausted farmland became harder to maintain. The farmers who depended on this land worked tirelessly. They did not ignore the problems around them. They experimented with different crops, created new farming techniques, and searched for ways to continue feeding their communities. Their efforts showed the incredible determination of ordinary Maya people. But the challenges facing them were becoming larger than any single village could solve. Inside the cities, rulers continued trying to maintain order. They held ceremonies, created alliances, and displayed their authority through grand architecture. The temples still reached toward the heavens, reminding everyone of the greatness of Maya civilization. However, a growing distance began to appear between the powerful and the ordinary people. When resources became limited, competition increased. When harvests became uncertain, people became more concerned about survival. When rulers demanded more labor for construction and ceremonies, some communities may have felt increasing pressure. The exact experiences of ordinary Maya families remain difficult for historians to fully understand because the ancient written records were mostly created by elites. The voices of farmers, workers, and villagers were rarely carved into stone. Yet their lives are hidden within the evidence they left behind. The remains of homes, the tools they used, the food they grew. These small discoveries reveal a simple truth. The Maya civilization was built not only by kings and priests, but by millions of ordinary people whose daily work kept the entire world alive. As night arrived over the ancient cities, the sounds of the rainforest surrounded the stone temples. The same stars that had guided Maya astronomers for centuries continued shining above the silent landscape. The people still hoped for better seasons. They still trusted their traditions. They still believed their civilization could endure. And perhaps that hope was the greatest strength of the Maya people. Because even as challenges increased, they continued searching for ways forward. The Maya cities entered a time when the ancient rhythms of life began to feel different. The morning sun still rose above the jungle. The rivers still moved slowly through the valleys. Birds still filled the forests with their songs. To anyone standing among the temples, the world might have looked unchanged. But beneath that familiar beauty, the foundations of society were becoming more fragile. For centuries, Maya rulers had relied on the belief that they maintained harmony between humans and the gods. Their ceremonies were designed to bring rain, protect crops, and ensure prosperity. When the harvests were successful, people saw it as proof that the relationship between their rulers and the spiritual world was strong. But when difficulties increased, maintaining that confidence became harder. A king could order ceremonies. A priest could offer prayers. A ruler could build another monument. But no human could command the clouds to bring rain. The Maya depended deeply on the natural cycles of their environment. The tropical forests could be generous, but they could also be unpredictable. Long periods of dry weather could create problems that affected every level of society. The first people to feel the pressure were often farmers. They watched the skies carefully. They counted the days. They protected every seed. They saved whatever food they could. For a family living near the edge of survival, a poor harvest was not just an economic problem. It meant uncertainty about the future. Would there be enough food until the next planting season? Would the stored water last through the dry months? Would their children have enough to eat? These were the quiet questions that many Maya families may have carried. At the same time, powerful cities continued competing for influence. Rival kingdoms fought battles that were recorded on stone monuments. Victorious rulers celebrated their achievements, while defeated cities lost power and prestige. War was not always the cause of collapse, but constant conflict created additional pressure during an already difficult period. Resources that could have supported farming or community needs were used for political struggles. Workers who could have helped strengthen cities were sometimes required for military efforts. Leaders who needed cooperation often faced rivalry instead. The Maya civilization had survived challenges before. Their ancestors had moved, adapted, and created new solutions throughout thousands of years of history. But the classic Maya period was facing a combination of problems unlike anything before. The climate was changing. The population was large. The environment was under pressure. Political systems were becoming unstable. No single problem was enough to destroy the civilization. But together, they created a challenge that became increasingly difficult to overcome. Still, the Maya cities were not empty. Their people had not disappeared. Life continued beneath the ancient pyramids, among the forests and fields that had supported generations before them. The story of the Maya collapse was not a sudden ending. It was a slow transformation, and as the centuries moved forward, the great cities would begin to reveal one of history's most mysterious journeys. The Maya world continued to change slowly, almost silently, like the movement of shadows across an ancient stone wall. The great cities were still filled with people, and many communities continued to experience moments of success. But the balance that had supported Maya civilization for so many centuries was becoming harder to maintain. In the central plazas, ceremonies still took place beneath towering temples. Priests carried out traditional rituals, musicians played ancient instruments, and crowds gathered to witness events that connected the living world with the spiritual one. These traditions had survived for generations, creating a powerful sense of identity among the Maya people. But traditions alone could not solve every challenge. The cities required food, the people required water, the rulers required trust, and all three were becoming increasingly difficult to secure. The forests around the cities continued changing. In some areas, farmers had to travel farther to find productive land. The soil that had once supported abundant crops needed more care and attention. Communities worked harder to produce the same amount of food that previous generations had enjoyed. For many families, survival became a constant effort. They adapted their farming methods. They shared resources. They found new places to settle. They relied on knowledge passed down from their ancestors. The Maya were not helpless victims of their environment. They were skilled people who understood their world deeply. They knew how to survive in difficult landscapes, and their ability to adapt had carried them through many challenges before. However, the problems of this period were different because they were happening across a large region at the same time. A drought in one city could be managed. A poor harvest in one area could be supported by neighbors. But when many communities faced similar problems, cooperation became much more difficult. The rulers who once controlled powerful kingdoms began facing questions about their ability to protect their people. Some cities lost influence as others became stronger. Political relationships changed, and old alliances began to weaken. Archaeologists studying Maya monuments have discovered that the number of royal inscriptions decreased in many regions during this period. The voices of kings that once filled the landscape with stories of victories and achievements became quieter. It was as if the civilization itself had begun speaking less. Yet silence does not mean disappearance. The Maya people continued living, creating families, growing crops, and maintaining their traditions. Some cities declined while others continued. Some communities moved to new locations where life was easier. The Maya civilization was not simply destroyed. It was transformed. As the centuries moved forward, the once powerful classic Maya cities of the lowlands slowly changed from centers of royal power into places where nature began reclaiming the spaces humans had built. The jungle slowly returned. Trees grew between stones. Roots wrapped around forgotten walls. And the temples that once represented human achievement became quiet reminders of a remarkable civilization that had entered a new chapter. The story of the Maya collapse was becoming more complex with every passing generation. The great cities of the lowlands were no longer experiencing the same confidence and stability that had defined earlier centuries. Yet life continued, and millions of Maya people still found ways to survive within a changing world. The forests remained vast and beautiful. Morning mist continued covering the valleys, and the sounds of wildlife still surrounded ancient settlements. But beneath this natural beauty were signs of a civilization adjusting to difficult circumstances. In some cities, the once powerful royal families began losing their influence. The monuments that had proudly displayed the names of kings became fewer. The grand ceremonies that once filled the plazas became less frequent. The political systems that had connected rulers and communities for centuries were slowly becoming weaker. For a civilization built around powerful city-states, this was a major change. The Maya world depended heavily on leadership. Kings organized labor, managed alliances, controlled trade, and performed religious ceremonies. Their authority helped unite thousands of people living in and around each city. When that authority weakened, communities had to find new ways to organize themselves. Some families moved away from large urban centers. Some settled in smaller villages. Some searched for areas with better access to water and fertile land. The great cities were not abandoned because people suddenly stopped caring about them. They were abandoned because, over time, living there became more difficult than living somewhere else. A city requires more than buildings. It requires food. It requires water. It requires cooperation. Without these things, even the most impressive temples and palaces cannot remain alive. The Maya people understood this reality through experience. They had always adapted to their environment. Their ancestors had survived changing climates, migrations, and conflicts. They carried knowledge that allowed them to continue even when older systems began to fail. Meanwhile, the natural world slowly began returning to places where humans had once dominated. Trees grew through empty plazas. Plants covered old pathways. Animals moved through areas that had once been crowded with people. The jungle did not destroy the cities, it simply waited. Over time, nature and human history became connected. The forests protected the remains of Maya achievements, hiding them from the outside world for centuries. When explorers eventually rediscovered these ancient places, they found silent cities surrounded by green wilderness. They saw enormous pyramids, carved monuments, and mysterious structures that raised countless questions. Who built these places? Why were they abandoned? What happened to the people who once filled these streets? For generations, these questions remained among the greatest mysteries of archaeology. But the truth was never a simple story of disappearance. The Maya did not vanish. Their civilization changed. Their descendants continued living across Central America, preserving languages, traditions, and cultural memories that reached back thousands of years. The ancient cities became quiet witnesses to a civilization that had faced extraordinary challenges. And as historians continued searching for answers, they discovered that the Maya collapse was not the end of a people. It was the beginning of a new chapter in their long and remarkable story. As the great Maya cities slowly changed, the forests began to hide the evidence of a civilization that had once seemed impossible to defeat. The towering temples remained standing above the trees, but the voices that had once filled the plazas became quieter with each passing generation. Still, the story of the Maya people did not end. Far from the abandoned royal centers, communities continued their daily lives. Farmers planted crops using knowledge inherited from their ancestors. Families gathered around fires in the evenings, sharing stories that carried memories of the past. Children learned the languages and traditions that had survived through centuries of change. The collapse of the great cities was not the disappearance of the Maya. It was the transformation of Maya society. Some historians once imagined the collapse as a sudden disaster where an entire civilization simply vanished. But modern discoveries have shown a much more complicated picture. Different cities experienced decline at different times. Some regions suffered greatly, while others remained active and powerful. The Maya world was never one single place. It was a collection of many communities spread across a vast landscape. This meant that change happened differently from one area to another. In some cities, rulers lost power and monuments stopped being built. In other places, people adapted and created new centers of life. Along the coast, trade continued. In northern regions, cities remained important. In smaller villages, families continued traditions that had existed long before the rise of the Great Pyramids. The Maya were not simply watching their world disappear. They were adjusting to a new reality. Yet the mystery surrounding the abandoned cities remained. Centuries later, when explorers entered the thick jungles and discovered massive stone structures hidden beneath vegetation, they were amazed by what they found. The jungle had protected the past. Ancient stairways covered with plants led upward toward forgotten temples. Carved stones revealed names of kings who had ruled more than 1,000 years earlier. Beautiful artwork showed scenes of ceremonies, battles, and daily life. Every discovery added another piece to the puzzle. Archaeologists began studying the evidence carefully, searching for answers about what had happened. They examined ancient lake sediments to understand past climates. They studied tree growth patterns to learn about periods of drought. They analyzed bones and pottery to understand how people lived. Slowly, a clearer picture began to emerge. The Maya collapse was not caused by one single event. There was no single enemy army that destroyed every city. There was no sudden disappearance of the people. Instead, many pressures came together over time. Environmental changes, political struggles, resource shortages, social challenges. Each one added another weight to a civilization already facing difficulties. And perhaps the most important lesson from the Maya story is that even the greatest achievements of humanity depend on balance. Stone temples can survive for centuries. Written records can preserve memories. But a civilization lives because people, resources, and the environment exist together in harmony. As another quiet night settled over the ancient Maya lands, the stars continued shining above the same forests and mountains that had witnessed the rise and transformation of this extraordinary civilization. The Maya story was not over. It was simply changing. The mystery of the Maya collapse continued to attract the attention of historians, archaeologists, and explorers who wanted to understand how such an advanced civilization could experience such a dramatic transformation. The more they studied the evidence, the clearer it became that the Maya story was not about a sudden ending. It was a long journey filled with adaptation, struggle, and survival. Deep beneath the forests of Central America, the remains of ancient cities continued revealing their secrets. Every broken piece of pottery, every carved stone, and every layer of soil contained a small piece of information about the people who once lived there. Archaeologists discovered that many Maya cities reached their greatest achievements during the Classic period, a time when art, science, architecture, and writing flourished. But they also discovered that this golden age contained the seeds of future challenges. The cities had become incredibly successful, and success itself created new pressures. More people meant more homes. More homes meant more resources. More resources meant greater demands on the environment. The Maya had created remarkable systems to survive in difficult landscapes, but those systems depended on careful balance. When conditions changed, the old methods became harder to maintain. One of the greatest challenges was water. The Maya lowlands did not have many large rivers flowing through the areas where many important cities were built. Instead, communities depended on rainfall and carefully designed reservoirs. During good years, these systems supported thousands of people. But during long periods of drought, the situation became much more difficult. Imagine a city filled with thousands of families, surrounded by magnificent temples and busy markets. Now imagine the skies becoming silent for months. The clouds that people depended on failed to bring enough rain. The reservoirs slowly became lower. Farmers looked across fields waiting for signs of improvement. A single drought could be survived, but repeated droughts could change everything. Food became harder to produce. Water became more valuable. People became more concerned about their future. The Maya were not powerless during these difficult times. They searched for solutions. They changed farming techniques. They moved to different locations. They adjusted their way of life according to the challenges they faced. This ability to adapt was one of the greatest strengths of Maya society. However, adaptation became harder when many problems appeared together. A farmer struggling with drought also faced political uncertainty. A ruler facing a loss of resources also faced challenges from rival kingdoms. A city already under pressure from environmental problems could become weaker because of conflict. The collapse was not a single moment when everything ended. It was more like a long sunset. Slowly, the brightness faded. The powerful cities of the classic Maya world gradually lost their central role. The sounds of construction became quieter. The number of royal monuments decreased. Some plazas that once held thousands of people became peaceful spaces surrounded by growing forests. But beyond those quiet cities, Maya life continued. People carried their knowledge forward. They preserved their languages. They maintained their traditions. They remembered their ancestors. The stones of abandoned temples told the story of a civilization that had faced enormous challenges. But the living Maya people told another story, a story of survival. As centuries passed, the great stone cities became quieter, but they did not disappear all at once. In some places, families remained for many years after the royal courts had lost their influence. Temples that had once hosted magnificent ceremonies were still respected, even if fewer people climbed their steep stairways. The change was gradual, unfolding across generations rather than a single lifetime. Imagine walking through one of these cities during this period. The market is smaller than it once was. Fewer merchants arrive from distant kingdoms. Some houses stand empty, while others remain full of life. Children still laugh as they chase one another through narrow pathways, and farmers still leave before sunrise carrying simple tools toward their fields. Life has become quieter, but it has not stopped. The rulers who once celebrated military victories now spend more time trying to solve everyday problems. Food must be distributed carefully. Water must be protected. Trade routes that once seemed reliable now require greater effort to maintain. Every decision carries more weight than before. For ordinary families, survival depends on cooperation. Neighbors help one another during difficult harvests. Seeds are saved for the next growing season. Water is used with greater care. Knowledge passed from grandparents becomes as valuable as any treasure made from jade or gold. Meanwhile, nature patiently continues its own rhythm. Trees begin growing between abandoned buildings. Vines slowly climb ancient walls. Colorful birds return to places where large crowds once gathered. The forest is not invading with anger. It is simply reclaiming space one season at a time. Centuries later, explorers would wonder how such enormous cities could vanish beneath thick jungle. The answer was surprisingly simple. Without thousands of people constantly repairing roads, clearing vegetation, and maintaining buildings, nature quietly resumed its work. Stone cracked, roots spread, leaves covered forgotten paths. Rain slowly wore away carved steps. Nothing happened quickly. Everything happened patiently. This slow transformation reminds us that history is often quieter than we imagine. Civilizations rarely end in a single dramatic moment. More often, they change little by little until one generation realizes the world they inherited is no longer the same as the one their grandparents knew. Yet through every change, the Maya people endured. They carried their languages into new villages. They preserved their customs. They adapted to new landscapes. The great cities became silent, but the culture remained alive. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson hidden within the forests of Central America. Stone monuments may fade, royal kingdoms may disappear, but a people determined to preserve their identity can outlive even the mightiest empire. As another peaceful evening settled over the ancient jungle, the stars above looked exactly as they had 1,000 years before, quietly watching history continue its endless journey. Harder to overcome. Even so, the story is not one of failure. It is a story of resilience. The Maya people survived changing climates, shifting kingdoms, and difficult centuries without losing the heart of their culture. Their languages are still spoken. Their traditions are still celebrated. Their history continues to inspire people around the world. And as the evening breeze moves gently through the forests where ancient temples still stand, the quiet stones remind us that civilizations may change, but the spirit of a people can endure far longer than even the strongest walls ever built. As researchers continued uncovering the story of the Maya, they realized that the word collapse could sometimes be misleading. It suggests that everything ended at once, but the evidence tells a gentler and far more complicated story. The great royal capitals declined, yet life continued across the Maya world in countless villages and smaller towns. In the northern regions of the Yucatan Peninsula, several cities remained active long after many southern centers had faded. Trade continued along the coast, bringing salt, pottery, textiles, cacao, and other valuable goods from one community to another. Families adapted to new conditions instead of waiting for the old world to return. This ability to adapt had always been one of the Maya people's greatest strengths. For thousands of years, they had lived among dense forests, rocky landscapes, seasonal rains, and changing environments. They understood that survival often depended on flexibility rather than strength alone. Communities that found reliable water sources prospered. Villages with fertile farmland continued growing. Merchants discovered new trade routes. Craftsmen continued passing their skills from parents to children. Life moved forward. Meanwhile, the abandoned cities slowly became part of the forest itself. Rain filled old reservoirs with clear water. Moss-covered carved staircases. Small trees rooted themselves between ancient stones before growing into towering giants. Birds nested inside palace walls where royal families had once gathered for ceremonies. The silence was peaceful rather than tragic. Nature was not erasing history, it was preserving it. For hundreds of years, the jungle acted like a quiet guardian, protecting temples and monuments until future generations were ready to rediscover them. When modern archaeologists carefully cleared away the vegetation, they uncovered far more than beautiful buildings. They uncovered evidence of remarkable intelligence, creativity, and resilience. Every inscription, every painted fragment, and every carefully placed stone revealed a civilization that had achieved extraordinary things despite living in a challenging environment. Today, millions of Maya descendants continue living across Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. They speak Maya languages, celebrate traditional festivals, weave beautiful textiles, and preserve customs that connect them directly to their ancient ancestors. The cities may have changed, the kingdoms may have disappeared, but the people endured. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson the Maya leave behind. The true measure of a civilization is not whether every monument survives forever. It is whether its knowledge, culture, and spirit continue living through the generations that follow. And in that quiet sense, the Maya never truly disappeared at all. As the mystery of the Maya continued to unfold, scientists began looking beyond temples and monuments. They searched inside caves, beneath lakes, and deep within the layers of ancient soil. These natural places had quietly preserved clues for more than 1,000 years, waiting for someone to understand their story. One of the most important discoveries came from the bottom of old lakes. Year after year, tiny layers of mud settled beneath the water, trapping pollen, dust, and minerals. By studying these layers, researchers could reconstruct the ancient climate with surprising accuracy. They found evidence that several long periods of drought, had affected large parts of the Maya lowlands during the same centuries that many great cities were declining. The evidence did not point to a single dry year. Instead, it suggested repeated droughts spread across decades. For a farming civilization, that kind of challenge could slowly reshape everyday life. Less rain meant smaller harvests. Smaller harvests meant fewer food reserves. With fewer reserves, even a short crisis became much more dangerous. Yet the Maya did not simply give up. Communities searched for new water sources, expanded reservoirs, and changed where they lived. Some families moved toward rivers or regions with more dependable rainfall. Others remained where they were, adapting as best they could to changing conditions. Their resilience is one of the most remarkable parts of this story. Even while great political centers weakened, ordinary people continued solving problems with patience and determination. Modern technology has also revealed hidden cities beneath the forest canopy. Using laser mapping from aircraft, archaeologists discovered thousands of buildings, roads, terraces, and defensive walls invisible from the ground. What once looked like untouched jungle was actually a landscape carefully shaped by generations of Maya hands. These discoveries changed how historians viewed the civilization. The Maya had supported enormous populations through remarkable engineering and careful planning. Their achievements were even greater than earlier researchers had imagined. But they also showed how dependent those systems were on balance. When climate, politics, resources, and population all came under pressure together, maintaining that balance became increasingly difficult. Today, every new discovery reminds us that history is rarely simple. The Maya collapse was not caused by one mistake or one disaster. It was a long chain of connected events, each influencing the next. And perhaps that is why their story still fascinates the modern world. It reminds us that even the greatest civilizations must continually adapt to changing environments, changing societies, and changing times. As the evening breeze moved gently through the ancient forests, the old temples remained standing beneath the stars, quietly guarding the lessons of a civilization whose greatest legacy was not only what it built, but how its people endured. The deeper archaeologists explored the ancient Maya world, the more they realized that its greatest story was not one of disappearance, but of resilience. Every excavation revealed another layer of human determination. Beneath fallen stones and tangled roots were the quiet traces of people who had spent generations adapting to a changing world. Some cities that had once been filled with thousands of residents gradually became smaller communities. Homes that were no longer needed were left behind, while families gathered closer to dependable sources of water. The magnificent temples still dominated the skyline, but daily life shifted away from the great ceremonial centers and toward practical survival. This was not an unusual response. Throughout history, people have moved whenever the land could no longer support them as it once had. The Maya were no different. They carried their farming knowledge, their languages, their beliefs, and their traditions wherever they settled. Although the cities changed, the people remained connected to their ancestors through stories, ceremonies, and everyday customs that continued from one generation to the next. In time, forests slowly reclaimed abandoned plazas. Rainwater collected inside silent reservoirs. Colorful birds perched upon monuments where kings had once announced victories. The jungle covered the evidence so gradually that it almost seemed gentle, wrapping the old cities in a blanket of green rather than destroying them. Centuries later, when explorers first stood before these towering ruins, many struggled to believe that such magnificent places had been built without iron tools, horses, or wheeled vehicles. Yet every carved stone proved the remarkable skill of Maya engineers, artists, and builders. Modern researchers continue uncovering new discoveries every year. Hidden roads connecting distant cities, ancient canals carrying precious water, terraces that protected farmland from erosion, homes belonging to ordinary families instead of royal elites. Each discovery paints a richer picture of everyday life. The Maya were not defined only by kings and temples. They were farmers rising before dawn, parents teaching children, craftsmen shaping pottery, merchants traveling through dense forests, astronomers patiently watching the stars. Together, they created one of the most extraordinary civilizations in human history. Perhaps the greatest lesson of the Maya is that success alone cannot guarantee permanence. Every society depends upon a delicate relationship between people, leadership, resources, and the natural world. When that balance weakens, change becomes inevitable. Yet change is not always the same as defeat. The Maya civilization transformed, but its people endured. Their descendants still live across Central America today, speaking ancient languages, preserving remarkable traditions, and reminding the world that history is not measured only by the rise and fall of cities, but by the enduring spirit of those who continue carrying their culture into the future. By the time the great classic Maya cities had faded into quietness, a new chapter was already unfolding across the region. Life did not stop when royal courts lost their influence. Instead, it found new paths. Families settled in places where fresh water was easier to reach, trade routes shifted toward the coast, and communities slowly adapted to a changing landscape. In the northern Yucatan, several important cities continued to prosper. Their markets welcomed merchants from distant regions, bringing salt, honey, obsidian, cotton, and finely crafted pottery. Canoes traveled along the coastline, carrying goods that connected communities separated by many miles. Commerce remained alive, proving that the Maya world still possessed remarkable energy and resilience. For ordinary people, daily life remained centered on simple routines. The morning began before sunrise. Fields were carefully tended. Water was collected and stored. Meals were shared with family. Children learned the skills that had sustained their ancestors for generations. These quiet moments rarely appear in royal inscriptions, yet they formed the true heart of Maya civilization. While kings built monuments, it was farmers who fed the cities. While priests observed the heavens, it was craftsmen who shaped tools, pottery, and clothing. Every member of society contributed to the survival of the community. Modern archaeology continues revealing this forgotten world. Excavations uncover ordinary homes alongside magnificent temples, reminding us that history belongs not only to rulers, but also to countless unnamed people whose daily efforts made civilization possible. Researchers now understand that many abandoned cities were not destroyed by invading armies or sudden disasters. Instead, populations gradually declined as families relocated to regions offering greater security and more dependable resources. Some buildings remained standing for decades after their last ceremonies had taken place. The silence arrived slowly. One family moved away, then another. Markets became smaller. Public celebrations became less frequent. Eventually, only the wind passed through plazas that had once echoed with thousands of voices. Nature patiently continued its work. Seeds carried by birds settled into cracks between stones. Young trees stretched toward the sunlight. Their roots slowly wrapped around ancient walls, holding them together even as they gently reshaped them. Centuries later, those same roots would help preserve the ruins until archaeologists uncovered them once again. Looking back across this remarkable history, the Maya remind us that civilizations are living systems. They grow, adapt, transform, and sometimes leave behind magnificent monuments that outlast the political worlds which created them. Yet beyond every temple and carved monument, the greatest legacy remained the people themselves. Their descendants continue to honor traditions, speak ancient languages, and preserve a culture whose roots reach back thousands of years. In that quiet continuity, the Maya story never truly ended. It simply continued in a different form. Today, when visitors stand before the towering pyramids of Tikal, Palenque, Calakmul, or Copan, it is easy to imagine them as lonely ruins lost in the jungle. Birds glide above the temples, monkeys call from the trees, and warm winds move gently through ancient stone corridors. Everything feels peaceful, almost timeless. But these silent places were once filled with life. The plazas echoed with conversations. Markets welcomed merchants from distant lands. Children played beneath the shadows of enormous temples. Priests climbed steep stairways before sunrise, carrying incense into the cool morning air. Every stone that remains today was once part of a living city. For many years, people believed these cities had been abandoned forever because of one terrible disaster. It was a simple explanation, but history is rarely that simple. Modern research has shown that the Maya world changed through a long series of events rather than a single moment of destruction. Climate shifted, political alliances weakened, trade patterns changed, resources became more difficult to manage. Populations moved toward regions offering greater opportunities. Each change influenced the next. None of them acted alone. Perhaps that is why the Maya story continues to fascinate people around the world. It reminds us that civilizations are not fragile because of one mistake. They become vulnerable when many small challenges quietly build upon one another over long periods of time. Yet there is another lesson hidden among these ancient stones. The Maya never truly disappeared. Across Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador, millions of Maya descendants continue speaking the languages of their ancestors. Traditional weaving, farming methods, music, ceremonies, and community customs remain part of everyday life. Their culture survived changing kingdoms, foreign invasions, and the passing of centuries. The cities changed, the rulers changed, but the people endured. As evening settles across the rainforest, golden sunlight slowly fades from the limestone pyramids. The forest grows quieter, just as it has every night for more than 1,000 years. Above the trees, the same stars appear that Maya astronomers once observed with such remarkable care. Those stars watched the civilization rise. They watched it transform. And tonight, they quietly watch over the descendants who continue carrying its story into the modern world. The mystery of the Maya collapse was never only about how great cities became silent. It was also about how an extraordinary people found countless ways to keep their history alive, generation after generation. The mystery of the Maya collapse was never only about how great cities became silent. It was also about how an extraordinary people found countless ways to keep their history alive, generation after generation. As the centuries passed, the ancient Maya cities became quieter, but they never truly disappeared. The great temples still rose above the trees, their stone walls glowing softly beneath the tropical sun. Vines slowly climbed across carved stairways, while birds and monkeys made their homes where kings and priests had once gathered. Nature was not destroying the cities. It was patiently reclaiming them. To later generations, these places became sacred reminders of the past. Local Maya communities never completely forgot them. They remembered old stories about the ancient cities hidden within the forests, even as the jungle grew thicker around them. When archaeologists finally began studying these ruins, they discovered something remarkable. The Maya had built far more than beautiful pyramids. They had created sophisticated water reservoirs, carefully planned roads, productive farming systems, and detailed calendars that tracked the movements of the heavens with incredible precision. Every new discovery challenged old beliefs. For many years, people thought the Maya had simply vanished. But the evidence told a different story. The cities declined, yet the people survived. Families moved to regions with more reliable water, better farmland, or stronger trade connections. Instead of disappearing, they adapted to a changing world. This may be the greatest lesson of the Maya civilization. Strength is not measured only by magnificent buildings. True strength is the ability to endure change. Today, millions of Maya descendants still live across Central America. They continue speaking Maya languages, preparing traditional foods, weaving colorful textiles, and celebrating customs that connect them to ancestors who lived more than 1,000 years ago. Their culture survived because it lived in people, not only in stone. As evening slowly settles across the rainforest, warm light fades from the ancient pyramids. The sounds of the jungle grow softer, and the stars begin appearing one by one above the silent temples. They are the same stars that Maya astronomers carefully observed so many centuries ago. The kingdoms may have faded, the rulers may have been forgotten, but the spirit of the Maya continues to live, carried quietly from one generation to the next. And beneath the peaceful forest canopy, the old cities still stand, reminding us that history is never completely lost. Sometimes it simply waits, patiently and silently, for someone willing to. Morning arrives gently over the ancient rainforest. A thin blanket of mist drifts between the trees as sunlight slowly reaches the tops of forgotten temples. For centuries, these stone structures have watched the seasons come and go without asking for attention. Rain falls, rivers rise, leaves grow and fade, and the jungle quietly continues its endless rhythm. If you stand here long enough, it becomes easy to understand why the Maya respected nature so deeply. The forest gives life. The forest takes back what is left behind. Nothing is rushed. Everything moves in its own time. Modern researchers now believe that the Maya collapse offers an important lesson for every generation. No civilization exists separately from the environment around it. Water, fertile soil, stable weather, and cooperation between communities are all connected. When one part of that balance changes, the others eventually feel the effect. The Maya were brilliant engineers and careful observers of the natural world. They built reservoirs, developed advanced farming methods, and studied the skies with remarkable accuracy. These achievements allowed their civilization to flourish for centuries. Yet even the greatest knowledge cannot stop every challenge. Sometimes people adapt. Sometimes they relocate. Sometimes society changes into something new. That is exactly what happened here. The great royal cities became quieter, but Maya culture continued through families, villages, and future generations. Today, visitors from around the world walk the same pathways where merchants, farmers, priests, and children once lived their ordinary lives. The silence they experience is peaceful rather than empty. Each carved stone still has a story. Each temple still reflects human imagination. Each tree growing beside the ruins reminds us that history and nature are always connected. As another calm evening settles across the forest, the warm air carries only the sounds of birds, insects, and distant leaves moving gently in the breeze. The ancient cities no longer rule kingdoms, but they continue teaching quiet lessons about resilience, balance, and the remarkable ability of people to endure. And beneath the endless stars, the story of the Maya continues, not through powerful kings, but through the descendants who still keep its spirit alive today. As the story of the Maya gently comes toward its final chapters, one truth becomes clearer than ever. History is rarely a tale of simple beginnings and sudden endings. Instead, it is a quiet river, flowing through countless generations, carrying both triumphs and hardships along its endless course. The Maya civilization lasted for well over 2,000 years. During that time, millions of people were born, raised families, planted fields, built homes, traded with distant neighbors, and watched the same stars pass across the night sky. Their lives were not defined only by kings or pyramids. They were defined by ordinary moments shared with those they loved. A child learning to plant maize, a potter shaping fresh clay, a grandmother telling old stories beside a warm evening fire. These simple moments formed the true heart of Maya life. The great temples that survive today are impressive, but they represent only a small part of the civilization. The real Maya world existed in thousands of homes scattered across forests, valleys, and hills, where ordinary families quietly built the future one day at a time. When conditions became difficult, those families adapted. Some moved to safer places. Some discovered new ways to farm. Others found new trade routes or joined different communities. Their willingness to change allowed their culture to survive long after many famous cities had become silent. That is why historians no longer see the Maya collapse as the disappearance of a people. Instead, they see it as the transformation of a civilization. Even today, the voices of Maya descendants can still be heard across Central America. Ancient languages continue to be spoken, colorful traditions continue to be celebrated, and skills passed from one generation to the next remain alive. The kingdoms faded, the forests returned, the people endured. As darkness slowly settles over the rainforest once again, the old pyramids stand quietly beneath a sky filled with familiar stars. They ask for nothing. They simply remain, patiently reminding every visitor that greatness is not measured only by how high a civilization rises, but by how gracefully its people carry their history into the future. And perhaps that is the quietest lesson the Maya leave behind. Night settles gently over the ancient Maya forests. The last rays of sunlight fade behind the limestone temples, and the sounds of the day slowly give way to the peaceful chorus of insects and distant birds. It is easy to imagine how similar this evening might feel to one experienced by a Maya family 1,000 years ago. Perhaps they sat together outside their home after a long day in the fields. Perhaps they shared a simple meal of maize, beans, and squash. Perhaps an elder looked toward the stars and told stories passed down from grandparents who had heard them from generations before. Those quiet moments rarely appear in history books, yet they are what truly kept Maya culture alive. Empires are often remembered for their rulers, their monuments, and their victories. But civilizations survive because ordinary people continue teaching their children, caring for their families, and preserving the traditions that give life meaning. The Maya understood this well. Even as powerful kingdoms changed, communities continued planting crops, weaving cloth, carving pottery, and speaking the languages of their ancestors. History did not end. It simply became quieter. Today, archaeologists still uncover new discoveries beneath the forests of Central America. Every buried building, every carved monument, and every fragment of pottery helps us understand a little more about this remarkable civilization. Yet some mysteries remain. We may never know every decision made by every ruler. We may never fully understand every challenge faced by every family. And perhaps that is part of the beauty of history. It always leaves room for wonder. As the cool night air drifts through the jungle, the ancient temples stand silently beneath a sky filled with countless stars. They have witnessed centuries of change without speaking a single word. If they could tell us anything, perhaps it would be this.
No civilización last forever.
But kindness, knowledge, and tradition can travel across generations, surviving long after kingdoms have faded into memory. The Maya left behind more than stone cities. They left behind a lasting reminder that human resilience is often stronger than time itself. And beneath the peaceful rainforest sky, their story continues to whisper softly through the trees. Now our journey through the story of the Maya gently comes to its end. The forests remain as they have for thousands of years, stretching across hills and valleys beneath an endless sky. Hidden among the trees stand the ancient temples, their weathered stones glowing softly in the morning sun and resting peacefully beneath the stars each night. They no longer echo with the voices of kings. The great ceremonies have long since passed. The crowded markets have fallen silent. Yet these places are not empty. They are filled with memory. The story of the Maya was never simply about a civilization that disappeared. It was the story of people who observed the stars, understood mathematics, built magnificent cities, mastered farming in a challenging environment, and created one of the world's most remarkable cultures. When their world changed, they changed with it. Some cities declined, others continued, families moved, communities adapted, traditions endured. Today, millions of Maya descendants still live across Central America. Their languages are spoken, their customs are celebrated, and their connection to the past remains alive. The civilization did not vanish. It transformed, carrying its spirit into every new generation. Perhaps that is the greatest answer to the question we asked at the beginning. What really happened to the Maya? There was no single disaster,
No mysterious disappearance.
no one dramatic ending. Instead, changing climates, political struggles, environmental pressures, and shifting populations slowly reshaped the ancient Maya world over many generations. The great cities became quiet, the forests returned, but the people remained. As you imagine the final scene, picture the warm evening breeze moving gently through the rainforest. Fireflies drift between the trees. The stars slowly appear above the silent pyramids, just as they did more than 1,000 years ago. Somewhere in the distance, a night bird calls into the darkness, and the jungle settles into peaceful silence. The ancient stones ask for nothing. They simply stand, patiently reminding us that every civilization leaves behind lessons for those willing to listen. And tonight, as the forest grows quiet and the stars continue their endless journey across the sky, the remarkable story of the Maya gently fades into the calm of history, leaving only silence, wonder, and the peaceful whisper of time itself. The end. Long after many of the great royal cities had grown quiet, the memory of the Maya civilization remained alive in the people themselves. Families continued planting maize in fertile valleys, craftsmen continued shaping clay into beautiful pottery, and elders continued telling stories beneath the evening sky. The stone kingdoms had changed, but the culture refused to disappear. For many years, outsiders knew very little about these ancient cities hidden beneath the jungle. Thick trees covered temple stairways, vines wrapped around palace walls, and birds nested where kings had once welcomed visiting rulers. Nature protected these places with remarkable patience, allowing them to rest in silence for centuries. When explorers eventually reached these forgotten ruins, they were overwhelmed by what they found. Towering pyramids rose above the forest canopy. Massive stone carvings displayed mysterious symbols unlike anything they had seen before. Entire cities stretched across the landscape, proving that millions of people had once built an extraordinary civilization in the heart of the rainforest. At first, many early explorers misunderstood what they were seeing. Some believed these cities had been built by people from distant lands. Others imagined fantastic stories about lost civilizations with no connection to the local population. But as archaeology developed, the truth slowly emerged. The builders had been the ancestors of the Maya people who still lived throughout Central America. Their descendants had never vanished. They had simply adapted as the world around them changed. Modern archaeologists began reading the ancient hieroglyphs carved into monuments. Piece by piece, forgotten names returned to history. Kings, queens, battles, ceremonies, and important events that had been silent for more than 1,000 years slowly found their voices again. At the same time, scientists studied lake sediments, cave formations, and ancient pollen preserved beneath the earth. These natural records revealed long periods of drought that matched the years when many cities declined. Other discoveries showed evidence of warfare, political instability, and environmental pressure. No single clue solved the mystery. Instead, each discovery added another piece to an enormous puzzle.